The quadratic formula's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a.
Howdy y'all! Today's lesson is on the quadratic formula. This is actually one of the few formulas that's given to you on the SOL test. So if you know how to use it, then you can use it every single time. And you actually don't have to memorize it because it will be given to you. It's kind of fun to memorize it though anyway. Alright, let's get started. Starting off right away with an example, we need to solve this trinomial using the quadratic formula. So this quadratic equation is already in standard form. If you recall, standard form of a quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c all equals 0. In order to use the quadratic formula, you have to know what your a is, your b, and your c. So let's talk about that right now. Given this quadratic equation, your a is going to be 1, right? Because there's nothing in front of that. It doesn't mean it's 0, it's just a 1. So we didn't write it. B is negative 6. C is positive 4. Let's get right to the quadratic formula now. So x equals negative b. Check it out. B is a negative number, but the formula tells me to write a negative. So negative, and then plug in your negative 6. That gives you your negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. So again, the negative numbers in parentheses are huge. It's so important that you guys remember that, because that would give you a totally different number if you didn't put it in parentheses. Okay, so be careful. And then my a value is just 1, so I plugged it in, and my c value is 4, so I just plugged it in there. All over 2a, so a is 1, so times it by 1. Multiply it by 1. Alright, and then let's go ahead and take this in a few steps. So I have a double negative here. I'm going to make this a positive. So positive 6 plus or minus the square root. So here, this would give me 36 minus 4 times 1 times 4. So 36 minus 16 gives me the square root of 20. And then it's all over 2. So check it out. Here's what happens here. We've got this plus or minus, and that's a really big deal here. That means I'm going to have two solutions most of the time, depending on what's under that square root sign. So here's how you get those two solutions. So here's our first one. X equals, it's plus, this is plus or minus. So you start off with your plus. So 6 plus the square root of 20 all over 2 is going to be one of our solutions. And then our next solution is going to be x equals 6 minus the square root of 20 all over 2a, which is just 2. Now be careful here when you're plugging this in your calculator. You need to make sure that you're telling your calculator to take 6 plus the square root of 20 all divided by 2. Okay, so put this in parentheses or take it in two different steps. So 6 plus the square root of 20 all divided by 2, same thing over here. When you do this, you should get two solutions. Your first one is 5.24, and your second solution is going to be 0.76. If you're unsure of your answers, especially in the beginning, this is really tedious work. Use your calculator to verify those zeros. Okay, make sure that your calculator is telling you that one of your zeros is at 5.24 and the other one's at 0.76. Use that to check your answers. Okay, so we're going to practice just a few problems. You can tell they take a long time to do here. So I'm going to jump right to x equals negative b, so negative 10 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so I've got a positive number, so 10 squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Alright, so plugging it in is half the battle, I promise. Make sure you put those negative numbers in parentheses when you're substituting them in. Let's go ahead and do this. So you've got negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 100, and then minus and double negative. So 100 plus 8, so 108 here. all over 2. You're going to break this up. So here's your first one. You're going to have x equals negative 10 plus the square root of 108 divided by 2. And then your next one is going to be x equals negative 10 minus the square root of 108 divided by 2. Okay, so be careful when you tell your calculator to do this. Make sure you're being very precise here. And for your answer, you should get curly brackets. We've got 0.20 as one of our zeros and negative 10.20. So we've got 2 solutions here. Verify it on your calculator. Make sure you're doing it right here. Moving right along to number 2. I'm going to move this over here because we have a little bit of work to do. You can see this is not in standard form, so this one's a little bit different. You got to move the 4x over before you can start using the quadratic formula. Okay, so move him over. Of course, you know you need to subtract it to move it over. So you're going to have x squared minus 4x minus 11 equals 0. And now it's in standard form. So I know my a is going to be 1, my b is going to be negative 4, my c is going to be negative 11. Let's go ahead and get started. So x equals negative b, so check this out, double negative again. And then I've got plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared, right, my b squared, minus 4ac all over 2 times a. Next step. So double negative here with my 4's, so 4 plus or minus, oops, the square root of, so 16 plus 44, that's going to give me the square root of 60 all over 2. Break this up into 2 different problems. So first I'm going to have 4 plus the square root of 60, all of that needs to get divided by 2. Then I'm going to have 4 minus the square root of 60, and all of that needs to get divided by 2. So I'm going to have 2 solutions, and those solutions are going to be 5.87 and negative 1.87. Okay, I'm going to jump around a little bit. I want you to do 3 and 4 on your own. You actually should get whole numbers for those. So those are maybe a little bit easier. Let's talk about number 5. It's one of kind of like a special case here. You can see if you plug this in your calculator, you can see right away what your answer is going to be. But let's use the quadratic formula. So x equals negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 10. And then all of this is going to be divided by 2a, so 2 times 1. Okay, so let's figure out what happens here. So I have x equals negative 6 plus or minus, and then I'm going to take this a couple steps here. So I have 36 minus 40. And then I'm going to be dividing by 2. So again, one more step. I've got x equals negative 6 plus or minus negative 4. Ooh, that is not good. All over 2. This right here, if this is less than 0, if it's a negative number, then you're going to have what we call no solution. If you plug this into your calculator, is actually when you get to calculus, you're going to see these are imaginary numbers. But for the sake of this class, when you can't take the square root of a negative number, okay? So because this is going to be no solution. So again, if you were to graph this in your graphing calculator, you would see that you've got a parabola. It's just floating in a quadrant. It never ever hits the x-axis. Okay, so verify that with your calculator. Make sure you agree with that. Okay, moving right along. This is going to be number 6 for you guys on your notes. Again, we have a equation that's not in standard form, so your first step should be to put this in standard form. So you're going to have 4x squared minus 12x plus 9 equals 0. Let's get rolling with the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b, so negative, double negative, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so put that in parentheses, squared minus 4ac. So now my 4 is actually, or my a is actually a number, it's 4, so plug in the 4 times the 9 all over 2a, but the a is 4. So there you go. All right, ooh, big numbers, but that's okay. Double negative here, make that a positive. So x equals 12 plus or minus the square root of, so there you're going to get 144 minus 16 times 9, big numbers. Okay, but if you take 144, all of this is going to give you 144 as well. So I have 144 minus 144, check it out, square root of 0, all over 8. So here's the deal. The square root of 0, whether you add, is just 0. Okay? So whether you add 0 or subtract 0, you get the same thing. Okay? So 12 plus 0 is 12. 12 minus 0 is also 12. Okay? So in this case, you actually have one solution. So whenever you have a 0 under the square root sign, you're only going to have one solution. Okay? So our solution here is going to be 12 over 8. But we know we're not going to leave it like that, so we have to keep going, reduce that fraction. So your final answer here is going to be 3 halves. And we only have one solution. This has been quite a long lesson already, and a very tedious lesson at that. So no time for jokes, so I apologize for that. I want you guys to fill in the gaps of those notes, take your time, verify your answers on your calculator, and raise your hand if you have any questions.